The morning Dorothy Norris drove the last of her father's cattle to the auction yard in Millhaven, she had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a letter from the county land office folded against her chest, and the quiet, unyielding certainty that she was not going to cry. She had cried enough already. She had cried the night her father, Eli Norris, fell from the barn roof trying to patch a leak in the middle of October, 1883, when the wind came screaming down from the mountains like something furious and alive. She had cried through the funeral, through the reading of the will, through the conversation with the bank in which the kind-faced man behind the desk explained, in a very gentle and very firm voice, that the debts owed against the Norris property totaled more than the property itself was worth. She had cried until she felt emptied out, until the tears stopped coming, not because the grief had passed, but because her body simply had nothing left to give. What remained, after all the crying and all the loss and all the quiet, humiliating paperwork, was this: 3 acres of land on the eastern edge of the Copper Valley in Colorado, land that the bank had deemed worthless enough to let her keep, land that sat at the base of a rocky hillside where the soil was pale and thin, and where nothing had grown in living memory except a few scrubby junipers and the bitter yellow grass that the cattle wouldn't touch even when they were starving. 3 acres nobody wanted. Dorothy Norris was 24 years old. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches in worn leather boots, with dark hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, somewhere between gray and green, that had a habit of going very still and very sharp when she was thinking hard about something. She was not the kind of woman who made a fuss. She had grown up on a working ranch, had learned to rope and mend fence and read weather before she learned to read letters, and she had her father's practical stubbornness in her bones like iron. She stood outside the Millhaven land office on a November morning in 1883, the letter in her hand, and looked out at the valley stretching west and south from the little town, all golden and amber in the late autumn light, the mountains rising blue and sharp beyond it, and she made herself a promise so quiet it barely needed words. She was going to make something of those 3 acres. She did not know how yet, but she was going to make something. The town of Millhaven sat at the center of the Copper Valley, and it was the kind of town that had grown up fast and a little crooked, the way most towns did out west in those years. There was a main street with a general store, a feed and supply merchant, a saloon called the Red Spur, a livery stable, a small church whose white paint was already beginning to peel in the dry mountain air, and a land office that doubled as the county courthouse on the 2 Tuesdays a month when the circuit judge came through. There were perhaps 300 people living in the valley proper, ranchers and farmers, and the merchants who served them, along with a small but growing population of newcomers who arrived each season with big hopes and not always the means to back them up. The biggest ranch in the valley belonged to a man named Garrison Holt, who had been there since before the town had a name, who ran several hundred head of cattle across some of the finest grass in the county, and who had a way of standing in the middle of any room he walked into, as though the room had been built specifically for the purpose of containing him. Garrison Holt was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, and accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he had made it known to anyone who would listen that he intended to expand his holdings as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Dorothy was aware of all of this. She was also aware that Garrison Holt had made an offer on her father's ranch before the bank had even finished processing the deed transfer, an offer so low it had felt like an insult, and that when she had politely declined to sell him the 3 acres the bank had left her, his face had gone the particular flat, cold kind of neutral that powerful men adopted when they were deciding how patient to be. She tucked that awareness away like a stone in her pocket and went to work. The first thing Dorothy did was spend 2 of her precious dollars on a soil test, or rather on the opinion of old Amos Briggs, who had been farming the valley since before the war, and who could read soil the way some men read newspapers, with a running commentary and strong opinions about everything. Amos walked her 3 acres with her on a gray December morning, crouching here and there, picking up handfuls of the pale earth and crumbling it between his fingers, tasting it once and making a face, and then standing at the base of the rocky hillside with his hands on his hips and his hat pushed back on his head. Nobody wanted this land for a reason, Amos said. He was not a man who softened things. I know that, Dorothy said. Tell me why specifically. Amos looked at her with something that might have been approval. Soil's thin, low on nitrogen. Rocky subsoil makes deep-root crops a misery. The hillside there blocks your morning sun in winter, which limits what you can grow year-round. He paused. However, Dorothy waited. Water, he said. He pointed to the base of the hillside where a seep of moisture darkened the pale rock. There's a spring in that hill. Probably not much, but consistent. In a dry summer, consistent water is worth more than good soil. What can I grow with consistent water and thin soil? Dorothy asked. Amos thought about it. Hardy vegetables if you amend the soil, but more importantly, he turned to face her directly. Horses. Dorothy looked at him. Not cattle, Amos said, waving his hand. Cattle need grass and range. You haven't got enough. But horses, good horses, broken and trained horses, those you can raise and sell for more per animal than cattle 10 to 1. You don't need acres for that the way you need acres for beef. You need a good corral, good water, and someone who knows what they're doing with horses. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, thinking. She had grown up with horses. She had ridden before she could walk well. Her father had always said she had a gift for it, the ability to go still inside herself and let the animal feel that stillness and settle into it. It was one of the few things she was genuinely, confidently good at. What would I need to start? She asked. Amos named the things. Fencing, a proper corral, a small stable, at minimum 1 good breeding mare, tools for the garden if she wanted to keep herself fed through the building years. He looked at her $4 when she showed him what she had and was quiet for a tactful moment. You'll need work, he said, or a partner. Dorothy went back to her tent, because she was living in a canvas tent on her 3 acres through the winter, which was as miserable as it sounds, and she sat with a lantern and a piece of paper, and she wrote out everything she knew how to do, and then she went into Millhaven the next morning and she got herself hired at the Red Spur as a cook. She was a very good cook. Her biscuits alone were worth talking about. Within 2 weeks the saloon's supper trade had doubled, and the owner, a stout and generally cheerful man named Corbett, was paying her fair wages and leaving her alone to run his kitchen however she pleased. She worked the dinner service 6 days a week and spent her mornings and her Sundays on her land, clearing brush, moving rocks by hand, beginning the slow, back-breaking work of building something out of nothing. She saved every cent she could. It was in February of 1884 that she first met Peter Atkins. He came into Millhaven on a gray Tuesday with a horse that needed shoeing and a reputation that had apparently preceded him, because when Dorothy came out of the general store and saw him standing at the hitching post outside the livery, she noticed that 2 of the men nearby had stepped a little to the side, the way people sometimes did around a man they were not entirely sure about. He was tall, lean in the way of someone who worked hard and did not always eat enough, with dark reddish-brown hair under a battered trail hat and a jaw that looked like it had been put together in a hurry. His coat was good quality but worn hard. He had the kind of hands, Dorothy noticed with the particular attention she always paid to hands, that looked capable and careful at the same time. He was arguing with Owen Fry, who ran the livery. "I'm telling you," Peter was saying, and his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not rise when it was making a point but somehow carried further for it. "She's thrown her shoe on the left rear, and you can see she's favoring it. That's not a horse that needs rest, that's a horse that needs a farrier." "I'm telling you the farrier's out until Thursday," Owen said. He was a small, put-upon man who disliked complications, and Peter Atkins appeared to be a complication. 2 days, Peter said. He looked at the horse, then back at Owen. She won't go lame in 2 days if she's properly stalled and not worked, but if she's put in the corral with the others and pushed around, she won't be pushed around, Owen said, a little irritably. Dorothy found herself walking over. She was not entirely sure why, except that she knew horses and she could see that the man was right. She looked at the mare. A bay quarter horse, probably 7 or 8 years old, compact and well-muscled, with an intelligent eye. The left rear hoof was indeed missing its shoe, and the horse was standing with her weight shifted off it slightly. Dorothy crouched down without asking permission and ran her hand down the leg, lifting the hoof carefully and looking at it. "She's not bruised yet," Dorothy said, looking up. "But the ground's been frozen. If you keep her still and on clean bedding through Thursday, she'll be fine. If she's worked before the shoe's replaced, even lightly, she'll bruise." She stood up and looked at Peter Atkins. Up close he was younger than she had first thought, probably around her own age, maybe a year or two older. He was looking at her with an expression that was caught somewhere between surprise and interest. "That's what I've been saying," he said. "I know," Dorothy said. "You're right." Owen Fry made a sound of professional offense and went inside. Dorothy handed the lead rope back to Peter Atkins. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, not deliberately, just the ordinary adjacency of passing something from one hand to another, and Dorothy noticed it the way you notice a small, unexpected thing, the way you notice a bird landing very close when you've been standing still long enough. "Dorothy Norris," she said. "Peter Atkins," he said. He held her gaze for a moment in that direct, unguarded way that was either confidence or honesty, she could not yet tell which. "You know horses." "I grew up with them," she said. "You ride through or staying?" "Staying, maybe," Peter said. "I'm looking for work. I heard there were ranches in the valley hiring." Dorothy thought of Garrison Holt, who was always hiring in winter, and who would work a man hard and fair, but who had a way of making the men who worked for him feel owned rather than employed. She thought of a few smaller operations who might have something. She thought with a small and slightly reckless internal movement of herself. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Horses mainly," Peter said. "Breaking, training, some farrier work. I'm not a smith, but I can set a shoe well enough in a pinch. I can build fence, run a corral. I was working a horse operation up in Wyoming for 3 years before I came south." Dorothy looked at him. She looked at his hands again, at the quiet steadiness of him, at the way he had been standing with his horse, the particular kind of attention a man paid to an animal that told you whether or not the animal trusted him. The mare was leaning slightly toward him. That was the most honest reference letter she knew of. "I've got 3 acres," she said. "East side of the valley, base of the hill, no stable yet, 1 partial corral, no horses yet. No wages I can offer except a share of what we build if we build it right, plus room and board once there's a room to board in." She paused. "Right now there is only a tent." Peter Atkins looked at her with something that shifted and settled into a kind of interest that was more than just practical. "That's honest at least," he said. "I don't have time to be anything else," Dorothy said. He thought about it for a moment, which she respected. She did not want a man who said yes too fast. Then he said, "Show me the land." She showed him the land. They walked it that same afternoon, the two of them moving through the thin February cold with their breath making small clouds in the air. And Dorothy showed him the spring seep in the hillside, showed him the rocky soil, and explained what Amos had told her, showed him the partial corral she had been building with salvaged timber. And she told him plainly what she intended to do, and how long she thought it would take, and what she could realistically pay once there was money to pay. Peter listened the way some people listen, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. He crouched at the spring seep and pressed his hand to the wet rock, thinking. He walked the fence line she had started and tested the posts she had set, nodded once at the 2 that were solid and pulled gently at the one that was not without saying anything about it. When they had finished walking, he stood in the middle of her 3 acres and looked around, and the late afternoon sun came through the junipers on the hillside and made patterns of light across the pale ground, and he said, You could put the stable here, against the hill. It'll give it natural shelter on two sides." "That's what I was thinking," Dorothy said. "The corral wants to be bigger than what you've started," Peter said. "If you're going to turn horses and not just hold them, you need room for it." "I know," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "I'll stay," he said. He stayed. The spring of 1884 was one of the hardest working seasons of Dorothy's life, and she had spent her entire life working hard, so this was a meaningful thing to say. She worked the dinner service at the Red Spur 5 nights a week instead of 6, negotiating the change with Corbett by promising him a standing order of fresh eggs once her small kitchen garden came in, and she spent every other waking hour on the land. Peter moved out of the boarding house after 2 weeks and set up his bedroll in the half-built stable, which was warmer than the tent and more practical. And within a month the stable was finished. A proper thing. Not large but solid, built from timber he and Dorothy hauled by rented wagon from the mill 16 miles down the valley road. They built the corral together, post by post, stretching the rails and testing each one, Dorothy learning in the first week that Peter worked at the same sustained pace regardless of weather or fatigue, that he did not rush and did not slack, and that his work, when you came back to look at it the next day, was still exactly as good as it had been when he did it. They were careful with each other in those early months. There was something between them from the start that both of them were aware of, and neither of them was ready to name. Dorothy was running on the thin edge of everything, her money, her energy, her patience, her hope, and she could not afford to make an error of the heart on top of everything else. Peter was quiet about his past in the way that men in the West were often quiet about their pasts, not hiding exactly, but not volunteering either, and Dorothy respected the privacy because she understood it. They talked about horses. They talked about soil and water and what it would cost to buy a breeding mare in spring. They talked about the valley, about the other ranchers, about what markets were good, and what the army post 50 miles north was paying for trained horses. Their conversations were practical and purposeful, and if sometimes the evening light stretched long over the valley and they sat on the fence rails in comfortable silence, and the silence felt like something more than just the absence of talking, well, Dorothy noted it and set it aside. In April, Dorothy bought her first mare. Her name was Clover. She was a 5-year-old chestnut quarter horse with a blaze on her forehead, and a temperament that Amos Briggs, who had helped Dorothy evaluate her, described as opinionated, which was his way of saying the horse knew what she wanted and was not shy about communicating it. Dorothy paid $22 for her, money she had been saving since November with the discipline of someone who could not afford a single unnecessary dollar, and she brought Clover home on a warm April morning with her heart hammering in a way she had not let it hammer since her father died. Peter was waiting at the corral gate. He watched Dorothy ride Clover in, watched the mare testing her, making small challenges with her shoulder and her head, watched Dorothy sit quiet and patient and absolutely immovable through all of it. And when Dorothy dismounted and came through the gate, there was something in Peter's face that she was not ready to look at directly, and so she looked at the horse instead. "She's good," Peter said. "She's wonderful," Dorothy said, and she could not keep the warmth out of her voice. Peter reached over and scratched Clover between the ears, and the mare, who had been suspicious of Dorothy for the better part of an hour, leaned into his hand with immediate and shameless trust. Dorothy laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, genuinely laughed, since before her father died, and the sound surprised her. Peter looked at her when she laughed, and he did not look away, and Dorothy felt the color come into her face and turned to attend to the mare's saddle and bridle with great concentration. They found a stallion to breed Clover to in May, a well-regarded quarter-horse stallion from a ranch 20 miles south, and paid the stud fee with the last of Dorothy's savings and a good deal of faith. By June, the kitchen garden was producing beans and summer squash and a quantity of tomatoes that Dorothy could not entirely account for, and she was selling vegetables to the general store, and to two of the households in Millhaven who had money enough to buy fresh food rather than growing it themselves. It was not much, but it was something. And something, Dorothy had learned, was the seed that everything else grew from. The trouble with Garrison Holt started in June. He rode out to Dorothy's land on a Tuesday morning when Peter had gone into town for supplies, and he sat on his horse at the edge of her property, and he looked at what she had built with an expression that was hard to read, part assessment and part something less generous. He was accompanied by two of his ranch hands, big men who rode close on either side of him in the way that men rode when they wanted you to notice how many of them there were. Dorothy came out of the stable with a pitchfork in her hand because she had been mucking out, and she looked up at Garrison Holt and said, "Good morning," in a perfectly pleasant voice. "Miss Norris," Holt said. He had taken to calling her Miss Norris in a way that managed to be both formally polite and subtly diminishing, as though the title itself was a reminder that she was unmarried and therefore somehow incomplete. "You've been busy." "I have," Dorothy said. "I heard you've taken on a hand," Holt said. "Atkins, is it? Wyoming man." "He works with me, yes," Dorothy said. Holt looked at the stable, at the corral, at the garden. "It's good work for 3 acres," he said, and the compliment had a shelf built inside it that held something else. "Of course, 3 acres is still 3 acres. You won't build anything that lasts on 3 acres." "I suppose we'll see," Dorothy said. Holt leaned forward on his saddle horn with the relaxed posture of a man who had never had to hurry anything. "I'll make you a fair offer," he said. "Same offer I'd make any of my neighbors. $50 for the 3 acres and the improvements. You could use that money to start fresh somewhere more manageable." $50. Dorothy looked at him steadily. $50 for the stable she and Peter had built, for the corral, for the mare, for the garden, for every working hour of the past 7 months. $50 to walk away from the last piece of land her father had ever owned. "I'm not interested in selling," Dorothy said. Holt's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it went a little colder. "You might find it harder going than you expect," he said. "Getting supplies in, finding market for what you produce. A woman on her own without connections in the valley." "I'm not on my own," Dorothy said, "and I'm not interested in selling." She paused just long enough to make it a period and not a comma. "Was there anything else?" Holt looked at her a moment longer, then straightened in his saddle and turned his horse. "Think on it," he said, and rode away with his men. Dorothy stood with the pitchfork in her hands until they were out of sight, and then she let out a long, slow breath and went back into the stable. Peter came back from town that afternoon and she told him about the visit. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the corral fence with his arms folded, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be a problem," Peter said. "He's already been a problem," Dorothy said. "He'll be a manageable one." Peter looked at her with that look she was getting to know, the one that was equal parts appreciation and concern, the one that made her feel as though someone was paying close attention to her, not in a presumptuous way, but in a careful, protective one. "What do you want to do about the supply issue?" he asked. "Because he's right that if he leans on the general store and the feed merchant, he can make things difficult." Dorothy had been thinking about this on and off since that morning. "Marcus Webb at the mill," she said. "I've been buying timber from him direct and he likes the straight dealing, and I've been supplying produce to Mrs. Calder at the hotel, and she's not a woman who takes well to being told what to buy." She thought a moment. "And there's the army post. If we can sell trained horses direct to the army, we're not dependent on local markets at all." Peter nodded slowly. "The army likes quarter horses," he said. "If Clover's foal comes out well and we can put a good basic saddle training on a few horses this season, I think we can get a hearing at the post." "Then that's what we do," Dorothy said. Peter uncrossed his arms and pushed off from the fence and looked at her with that look again. And this time Dorothy did not look away fast enough. And for a moment they were just standing in the warm June evening looking at each other. And the air between them had that quality again, that weighted, particular quality that she had been noting and setting aside for months. "Dorothy," Peter said, and her name in his mouth had a tone to it that made something shift inside her chest. "Not yet," she said, very quietly, not unkindly. He was still for a moment. Then he nodded, and something in his expression was both patient and full of feeling. "All right," he said. Clover's foal was born in early July. A colt, bay like his mother, with a white sock on his right foreleg. And Dorothy was there for the whole of it. Had been there through the long night before with a lantern and her hand on Clover's neck, speaking low and steady in the voice she used with horses when they needed anchoring. Peter had been there too, the two of them sitting on the other side of the stall wall as the night stretched toward dawn, not talking much, but present in the way that felt important. And when the colt finally arrived and stood on his unsteady legs in the gray morning light, Dorothy felt something break open in her in the best possible way. She named the colt Copper for the valley. Peter watched her with him that first morning, watched the way she moved with the foal, quiet and certain, the way she let him come to her rather than going to him, and he said, "You're the best natural horseperson I've ever worked with." "My father taught me," Dorothy said, not looking up from the colt. "What was he like?" Peter asked. It was the first time he had asked about her father directly. Dorothy was quiet a moment, her hand moving along Copper's neck. "He was patient," she said, "and funny, in a dry way that snuck up on you. He always said a thing worth doing was worth doing every day until you didn't have to think about it anymore." She paused. "He'd have liked you." Peter did not say anything for a moment. Then quietly, "I'm glad." July brought heat and hard work and a succession of small victories. The kitchen garden was thriving beyond anything Dorothy had realistically hoped for, and she began selling surplus to 2 more households in Millhaven and to the cook at the Red Spur, which felt like a particular satisfaction, given that she had been cooking there herself 6 months ago. Corbett had been sorry to lose her to her own land, but he was a fair man, and he bought her produce without argument, and kept a standing order on her eggs once her 3 laying hens arrived in June. Peter began working with 2 additional horses that they had acquired in July on a deal that Dorothy was quietly proud of. A rancher 30 miles east named Caldecott had 2 young horses, a 3-year-old gelding and a 4-year-old mare, that he could not afford to keep and could not sell as untrained stock. Dorothy offered to take them for 30 days, train them to saddle, and split the sale price with Caldecott. It was the kind of deal that required trust on both sides, and that Caldecott, who had heard enough about Dorothy Norris's honesty, by then from people in the valley, was willing to make. The gelding was quick to learn and sweet-tempered. The mare took 2 weeks and all of Peter's patience and considerable skill, and watching Peter work her was one of the things Dorothy found herself looking forward to each morning in a way that was only partly about the horse. He had a way with a difficult animal that was neither forceful nor soft, but something altogether more nuanced, a quality of complete attention that the horse eventually responded to the way you respond to someone who really sees you. Dorothy was watching him from the fence one afternoon in late July, the heat hanging over the valley in golden waves, when she realized that she had stopped thinking, not yet. She was not sure exactly when it had happened. It had happened gradually and then all at once, the way most important things do. She had looked up from the fence and seen Peter Atkins standing in the center of the corral with the difficult mare finally standing easy beside him, his hand on her neck, his face turned slightly into the sun, and the knowledge had simply been there, solid and clear and undeniable. She did not do anything about it immediately. She was still Dorothy Norris, practical to her bones, and she had a season to finish, and a horse operation to build and garrison Holt's particular kind of discouragement to manage. But she carried the knowledge with her in the way you carry something important, carefully, with awareness of its value. It was the letter from the army post that changed things. In August, Peter had ridden the 50 miles north to Fort Connor and presented their horses and their training methods to the lieutenant in charge of remount procurement. He had been gone 4 days, and when he came back with a contract. A preliminary one, cautious and conditional, but a contract nonetheless, for 2 trained quarter horses at $65 each, with the possibility of a standing order if the horses proved satisfactory. He rode into the yard on a hot August afternoon and swung down from his horse and walked to where Dorothy was working in the garden, and he held out the folded contract, and she opened it and read it standing up with the sun in her face and her hands not entirely steady. $130, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. For 2 horses, Peter said. We have both horses ready. The money comes when we deliver. Dorothy looked up at him. She was aware that her eyes were bright in a way she was not going to be able to conceal, and she did not particularly try. Peter, she said. It's a start, he said, but he was smiling, and his smile was a thing she had not seen enough of, rare and genuine. It changed his whole face. It's more than a start, Dorothy said. They stood in the garden in the August heat, the 2 of them, looking at each other over a contract that represented months of work and faith and stubbornness. And Dorothy took 1 step forward, and Peter took 1 step forward, and she took hold of his forearm with both hands and looked up at him and said, "Thank you." Peter looked down at her hands on his arm and then up at her face, and his expression was open in a way it was not always open, the carefully maintained reserve of a man who had learned to be measured with himself, simply not there for a moment. "Dorothy," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who waited for things to be done to her when she could do them herself, she went up on her toes and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, warm and certain and very honest. She settled back on her heels and looked at him, her hands still on his arm, and his hands had come up to rest at her waist, and they were both very still. "I've been waiting for that since February," Peter said, and his voice was different, lower, the particular quality of a man who has stopped being careful about what he reveals. "I know," Dorothy said again, and she was smiling now, and it felt like something opening after a long winter. "I have things to tell you," Peter said, "about where I came from, why I'm here. I've been putting it off." "Then tell me," Dorothy said, "tonight when the work is done. We'll sit on the fence and you'll tell me, and I'll tell you things too." That evening, they sat on the top rail of the corral fence as the sun went down behind the mountains and turned the sky the color of peach and copper and the first quiet blue of evening, and Peter told her about Wyoming. He had worked for a large horse operation there, he said, a good operation run well, and he had been there 3 years and had learned more than he had in all his years before about training horses properly. But the owner of that operation had a son, grown and ambitious, and the son had decided that he wanted Peter's position, and the father, who was a good man but a father first and a fair employer second, had let it happen gradually, had not been dishonest but had not been honest either, had moved Peter sideways and then further sideways until there was no place left for him except somewhere else. "It wasn't violent," Peter said. "Nobody did anything wrong exactly. But I left owing nobody anything and with nothing owed to me, and I came south because I'd heard the Copper Valley was building." He looked at the darkening mountains. "I wasn't expecting to find someone building on 3 acres nobody wanted." "Were you expecting to stay?" Dorothy asked. He looked at her. The evening light was in his eyes. "I am now," he said. She reached over and took his hand. He turned it and held hers, and they sat on the fence in the warm end of an August day, while Clover and young Copper moved peacefully in the corral below them, and Dorothy felt something settle into place inside her that had been displaced since October, since the wind and the fall and the terrible silence of her father's absence, something that felt like being home in a way that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the person sitting beside her. Dorothy told him about her father, about growing up on the ranch, about the joy of it and the labor of it, about the way her father had let her be herself rather than trying to make her fit a mold she didn't belong in, about the years after her mother died when it had been just the 2 of them, and how they had made a life that was whole despite being different from what people expected, about the fall from the roof and the cold October night and the weeks of numbness afterward and the bank and the letter and the 3 acres and the tent. "I was so angry," she said. "Not at anyone in particular, just at all of it. the whole arrangement of things. That a person could work their whole life and then fall off a roof and have almost nothing left. That anger, Peter said, made you build a stable. Dorothy laughed softly. It did, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way of a man who means something entirely by a small gesture, and Dorothy felt the warmth of it all the way through her. The horses went to Fort Connor in September, and the $65 price held for both animals, and the lieutenant sent word with the rider who came back with the receipt that the post would want 4 more horses before spring if the quality continued. Dorothy and Peter sat at the small table in the cabin they had finally built in August, because the tent had not been appropriate for a Colorado winter, and the stable had been Peter's domain for long enough, and they did the arithmetic together by lamplight. With $130, they could buy 2 more mares, expand the corral, put in a proper well instead of relying entirely on the spring seep, and have money left against the winter. If they could produce 4 trained horses by spring and the Army held to its price, they would have $260, which was more than Dorothy had possessed at any point in her life. Peter was watching her do the figures, and she was aware of his watching in the warm, specific way she had become aware of everything about him, the way he watched things he cared about, fully and without apology. "You're going to need more land," he said. Dorothy looked up. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it. There are another 12 acres adjacent on the south that belong to the county, not Holt. Amos told me they've been on the tax rolls as unclaimed since the original territorial survey. If I can pay the back taxes and file a homestead claim, how much?" Peter asked. "Amos thinks $40, she said, give or take, for the back taxes. The homestead filing itself is a standard fee." Peter was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and put $20 on the table between them. Dorothy looked at the money, then at him. "That's yours," she said. "We're in this together," Peter said simply. Dorothy looked at the money on the table and then at Peter Atkins, who was sitting across from her in the lamplight with that expression she knew now as the one that meant he was certain about something, and she felt something move in her chest that was large and warm and a little frightening in its completeness. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "Are you staying?" she said. "I mean truly staying. Not because the work is good or the horses are promising, because you want to be here in this valley on this land with me." Peter did not hesitate. "I want to be here with you," he said. "The land and the horses are things I love because you love them and we built them together, but it's you I'm staying for." Dorothy folded her hands around the $20 on the table and looked at him for a long moment. "Then stay properly," she said. It took him a moment to understand what she meant. When he did, the expression that crossed his face was so unguarded and so full of feeling that Dorothy felt her own eyes go bright. "Dorothy Norris," he said, and her name had that tone again, the one that made her feel entirely present and entirely chosen. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I believe I am," she said. "Yes," Peter said. He said it the way you say a thing you have been saving up to say for a long time, with all the weight of its meaning intact. They were married in December of 1884 by the circuit judge in the Millhaven courthouse, which was also the land office, which Dorothy found privately satisfying. Amos Briggs was there, and Mrs. Calder from the hotel, and Corbett from the Red Spur, and a handful of other people from the valley who had been watching Dorothy build something out of nothing for the past year, and who had developed the particular affection that people develop for a person who refuses to give up. Peter had nobody of his own there, which Dorothy felt the weight of, but he stood beside her with that steady, certain presence that was entirely him, and when the judge read the words and Peter took her hand and looked at her, the whole room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when 2 people are being entirely sincere with each other. After Mrs. Calder threw a supper in the hotel dining room, and Corbett brought a bottle of good whiskey, and someone brought a fiddle, and the evening went long and warm and full of laughter. Dorothy danced with Peter for the first time that night in the cleared space in the center of the hotel dining room, and he was a better dancer than she had expected. Not elegant exactly, but confident. And he held her hand and kept his other hand at her waist and looked at her the whole time they danced with that look she knew so well now, that careful, full, unguarded attention. "Married," she said, trying out the word. "Married," he agreed, smiling. "How does it feel?" she asked. He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. "Like something being finished," he said, "and something beginning." Dorothy thought about this. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." The 12 adjacent acres were filed in January of 1885. The homestead claim approved with less difficulty than Dorothy had expected. Perhaps because Garrison Holt did not know about it until after the paperwork was done, at which point the county had confirmed the claim, and there was nothing he could say that was worth saying. When he found out, he rode out to her land again, and this time Peter was there, standing easy in the yard with that low, even quality of someone who is not looking for trouble but is entirely prepared for it if it comes. Holt sat his horse at the edge of the property and looked at the claim notice Dorothy held up. 15 acres total, Holt said, and something in his voice had shifted from condescension to something nearer respect, though it was a grudging kind. 15 acres, Dorothy confirmed. Holt looked at Peter and then back at Dorothy. "You're going to put horses on all of it," he said. It was not quite a question. "Horses and some pasture," Dorothy said. "The south end has good grass." Holt was quiet a moment. The horses in the corral moved, and the cold January air carried the smell of pine from the hillside and the smoke from the cabin chimney, and the three of them stood in the kind of silence that meant something was being decided. "Your horses at Fort Connor," Holt said finally. "The Lieutenant Parker, he's been talking about them. Says you sent him 2 that were better trained than anything he's bought in 3 years. We're pleased with them," Dorothy said. "I run a lot of cattle," Holt said, "and not enough trained cow horses. I've been buying from a man in New Mexico, and the prices are something awful." He paused, and this was clearly costing him something, this directness, this shifting of position. "I might have some business to discuss." Dorothy looked at him. She thought about the morning he had sat on his horse in front of her with his 2 men on either side and told her she would not build anything that lasted on 3 acres. She thought about the suggestion that her supplies might become difficult to obtain, the quiet threat beneath the polite words. "We're open to discussing business," she said. "Come back when the ground is thawed and bring what you have in mind." Holt nodded. He rode away without his 2 men for once, which felt significant. Peter came to stand beside her and they watched Holt go, and then Peter said, "He's going to become a customer." "A civil one, I hope," Dorothy said. "If he isn't, you'll make him one," Peter said. The winter of 1885 was long and cold, and they worked through it with a focused intensity that was also somehow, Dorothy thought, a kind of happiness, the happiness of people who are doing work they believe in with a person they love in a place they have made their own. They planned the expansion of the stable, drew it out on paper by lamplight with the wind outside and the fire inside and copper growing fast in the main corral, beginning to show the lines of what he was going to be. Peter had an eye for a horse's future that was almost uncanny. He could look at a colt and see the adult shape waiting inside the young body, and he said that copper was going to be something special. "Not just for looks," Peter said one evening, looking at the colt through the stable door. "His dam had a good temperament, but she was opinionated, remember. He's got her intelligence, but without the edge. He's going to be trainable and athletic both." "Are we keeping him?" Dorothy asked. Peter looked at her sideways. "That depends on whether you can bear to sell him." Dorothy thought about this honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Then we wait and see," Peter said, which was very much how he handled most things, with patience and without forcing. By March of 1885, they had 4 horses in training for the Army contract, and 2 young mares that Dorothy had purchased at a late winter auction, buying well below their value because nobody else at that particular auction had known enough about horses to see past the poor condition they were in. Proper feeding and good handling transformed them inside of 6 weeks into animals with genuine potential, and Peter shook his head when he looked at them and said, "You have a sense for this that's not teachable." "My father said the same," Dorothy said, and the mention of her father came now with a warmth where before it had come with an ache, which she recognized as a kind of healing. Spring came to Copper Valley in the way Colorado spring always came, late and abrupt, and then suddenly everything at once. The snowmelt rushing down the hillside and filling the spring seep to overflowing, the new grass coming up bright and tender across the expanded pasture, the horses moving differently in the good air. Dorothy's kitchen garden expanded to include a full half-acre of vegetables, with a proper irrigation channel cut from the spring, and she hired a girl from town, 14-year-old Nell Harwick, to help with the garden 3 mornings a week in exchange for produce her family could use and a small wage. The Army horses were delivered in April, all 4 of them, and the lieutenant at Fort Connor, a methodical and particular man named Parker who Dorothy had met once now and liked for his directness, sent back a letter with payment and a standing order for 6 horses a year at $65 each. $390 annually, on top of the produce sales and the private horse training work that was beginning to come in as word spread through the valley. The word had been spreading since winter. People talked, in small towns and in valleys where everyone knew everyone, and what they were saying about Dorothy Norris and Peter Atkins and their operation at the east end of the valley was the kind of thing that started conversations over dinner and continued them in the feed store and at the church on Sundays. They were saying that the Norris horses were unlike anything else coming out of the valley. They were saying that a horse trained at the Norris place knew its job and did it without fuss and lasted longer under hard work than horses trained rough. They were saying that Dorothy Norris had taken the worst 3 acres in the county and made something that the biggest rancher in the valley was now bringing his business to. Garrison Holt came in April with his request for 4 cow horses, trained for cattle work specifically, and he paid the asking price, which was higher than his New Mexico supplier, because Peter sat with him and explained exactly what the training involved and what it produced, and Holt, who was a practical man when something was in front of his face clearly enough, understood the value. It was the kind of validation that Dorothy would have been deeply moved by if she had had time to be moved by it. She largely did not have time. There were horses to work and a garden to manage, and the expansion of the stable that they had planned all winter to begin, and the accounts to keep, and the ongoing negotiation with the county about the water rights to the spring, which was an entirely separate and fairly tedious thread of bureaucracy that Dorothy was determined to resolve before it resolved itself against her. The water rights were resolved in May in Dorothy's favor through a combination of Amos Briggs's testimony about the spring's history, a careful review of the original territorial survey, and the fact that Dorothy had filed all her paperwork with a thoroughness that left no legitimate avenue of challenge. It was the week after the water rights were settled that Dorothy realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Peter, not because she was uncertain about his response, but because she wanted to have the feeling to herself for a little while first, to turn it over and know it in the particular private way of the first days of knowing something enormous. She told him on a May evening sitting on their front step, with the last of the sunset dying on the mountains, and the valley filling up with blue shadow, and the sound of the horses in the corral, and the smell of the garden coming sweet on the warm air. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him, and she watched his profile while he processed it, and she saw the moment it became fully real to him because something in his face softened and then broke open in the way it had when they had found the Army contract. That same quality of something hoped for being suddenly and irreversibly true. "When?" he said. "I think around Christmas," she said. Peter turned to look at her, and there were the early signs of tears in his eyes, which she had not expected, which she found extraordinarily moving. He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat there in the May evening on the step of the cabin they had built from nothing on the land that nobody wanted, and Dorothy felt the whole of it, the whole improbable, beautiful, accumulated weight of the past 18 months all at once. "Are you frightened?" Peter asked. "A little," Dorothy said honestly. "You?" "Yes," he said, equally honest. "And very happy." "Both at once," Dorothy said. "Both at once," he agreed. The summer of 1885 was the summer that the Norris operation, which they had been calling formally the Copper Valley Horse Ranch since the spring, began to genuinely be talked about. Not just in Millhaven, not just in the valley, but in the broader way of a thing whose quality had traveled outward, from the army post to other posts, and from those posts to military communities, and from there into the wider network of people who cared about horses. A man named Beaumont came from Santa Fe in July. He was a horse trader on a larger scale, connected to buyers in Texas and in the territories, and he had heard about their stock from the lieutenant at Fort Connor, and he arrived with a direct manner and specific questions, and a willingness to pay well for quality, which Dorothy respected. He sat with her and Peter in the kitchen for 2 hours and drank 3 cups of coffee and asked questions that showed he knew what he was talking about. He ended up offering to take 3 of their best-trained horses at $80 each, 20% above their standard Army price, for buyers he had in Texas. He also offered a longer-term arrangement, which Dorothy thought through carefully and did not accept immediately, because she had learned that first offers from buyers on long-term arrangements were starting positions rather than final ones. She wrote back to Beaumont 3 weeks later with a counter-proposal, and after 2 rounds of letters, the arrangement settled at $75 per horse for a minimum of 4 horses per season designated to his Texas buyers, with Dorothy maintaining the right to accept or decline individual orders if she judged the horses not ready. It was a good deal. It was the kind of deal that set the shape of something growing from a small thing to a real thing. Peter read the final terms and looked at her with that expression she loved and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "I just read everything my father ever had to negotiate and remembered how it went wrong," Dorothy said. By August, with the pregnancy becoming visible and the operation running at a level that required more hands than 2 people could provide, they hired their first full-time employee. His name was Cal Jennings, a 22-year-old from a farming family south of Millhaven, who had been working odd jobs since his family's farm failed in the drought of the previous year, and who turned out to have a real aptitude for horses and an excellent work ethic, and a cheerful disposition that made the long days easier to get through. Cal moved into a small bunkhouse that Peter built against the east side of the stable, and he worked hard and learned fast and developed a particular skill with the younger horses, the ones that were just beginning their training, at the stage where consistency and patience mattered most, and where a wrong move could set a horse back weeks. The bunkhouse went up in 4 days. Timber and sweat, and the particular satisfying rhythm of 2 men who had learned to build together. And when it was done, Peter stood back and looked at it, and then looked at the whole property, the stable and the expanded corral and the cabin and the garden and the pasture and the 15 acres of land that nobody had wanted. And Dorothy came to stand beside him, her hand over her growing middle, and she looked at it too. "Do you remember the tent?" she said. "I remember the tent," Peter said. "Do you know what I thought when I first walked these 3 acres?" Dorothy said. "Tell me," he said. "I thought I was going to make something," she said. "I didn't know what, I just knew I was going to make something." Peter put his arm around her. "You made several things," he said. "We," she corrected. He kissed the top of her head. "We," he agreed. The autumn of 1885 was golden and long and full. The Army order was filled and delivered. The Texas horses went south with Beaumont's man in October, and the letters of satisfaction that came back were the kind that Dorothy kept in the wooden box with her other important papers, her land deed, her marriage certificate, her father's watch. Garrison Holt's cow horses had been reported to him as the best he had ever had in his operation, and he came back in September with an order for 3 more, and in a manner that was somewhere between respectful and slightly irritated, the manner of a man who has been proven wrong and is handling it with moderate grace. Dorothy received him on her front step with a cup of coffee and a calm, fair manner that owed nothing to spite and everything to the certainty of someone who had earned their standing. They negotiated briefly and cleanly, and parted with a handshake that was not warm exactly but was genuine. "He'll never like me," Dorothy said to Peter that evening. "He doesn't need to," Peter said. "He needs to pay you." "Which he does," Dorothy said. Promptly, Peter said, "which is better than being liked." Dorothy laughed. "My father would have said the same thing." She thought about her father more in that golden autumn than she had since the first dark months after losing him, but the thinking was different now. It was the kind of thinking you do when you want to show someone something, when you have something you are proud of and you wish they could see it. She talked to him sometimes in the quiet of early morning when she was in the stable before the men were up, told him about the operation, about Peter, about the child that was coming. And she was not sure what she believed about where people went when they died, but she felt the talking as useful and real regardless. The child arrived in the second week of December, in the cabin, with the snow falling outside, and Mrs. Calder, who had delivered several babies in her years in the valley, serving as midwife with a no-nonsense competence that Dorothy found deeply reassuring. Peter was outside the door through the labor, not because anyone had sent him out, but because he was the kind of man who understood when his presence would help and when it would not, and the sounds from inside the cabin over those long hours were apparently sufficient to test him, because when Mrs. Calder opened the door and said, "You have a son," Peter's face went so white and then so full of color that Mrs. Calder actually laughed. He came in and Dorothy was sitting up against the pillows with the baby wrapped in a blanket her mother had left her, a quilt of blue and cream that had been folded in the cedar chest since Dorothy was 12, and she held up their son, and Peter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him with an expression that was beyond description, and yet also very simple, the expression of a man at the absolute center of his own life. "Hello," Peter said to the baby, very quietly. The baby was small and red-faced and perfect, with a surprising quantity of dark hair, and the particular earnest expression of a newborn who has just completed an enormous amount of work and is taking stock of the situation. "What do we call him?" Dorothy asked. Peter looked at her. "You choose," he said. Dorothy had been thinking about names through the whole long autumn. "Eli," she said, "for my father." Peter nodded slowly and completely. "Eli Atkins," he said, and the name sounded right the moment he said it. It had the weight and fit of a thing that belonged. "Eli Norris Atkins," Dorothy said. "Both names." "Both names," Peter agreed. Outside, the snow was falling on the Copper Valley Horse Ranch, on the stable and the corral where the horses stood easy in their stalls, on the pasture and the garden under its winter cover, on the 15 acres that nobody had wanted, on the hills and the fields and the whole broad sleeping valley. And inside, by the fire that Peter had kept burning all night in the cabin he and Dorothy had built together, a family of 3 was meeting for the first time. The winter passed, and then the spring came again. By the spring of 1886, the Copper Valley Horse Ranch was the most talked-about operation in the valley. This was a fact that Dorothy accepted with neither false modesty nor excessive pride, but with the practical satisfaction of someone who had planned for an outcome and achieved it. People came to look. Ranchers from 2 counties over made the drive to see what the operation was and how it worked. 2 of the valley's smaller ranchers approached Dorothy about purchasing young stock with a training guarantee, a new kind of arrangement she had devised over the winter, in which they paid a deposit on a yearling, and the balance when the horse reached its 2nd year fully trained, which spread the financial risk for the buyer and ensured a quality market for Dorothy and Peter. The arrangement proved popular. They were working with 6 horses at various stages at any given time by the summer of 1886, and Cal Jennings had been joined by a second hand, a quiet man of 30 named Henry Torres, whose family had deep roots in the territory, and who brought a knowledge of the land and the seasons that complemented everything else. Henry was a skilled horseman in a tradition that was different from Peter's but not lesser, and the two men developed a working relationship over months that was genuinely productive and had the easy quality of people who respected each other's abilities. Dorothy watched the operation grow through the summer of 1886 with young Eli in a sling on her back or on a blanket in the shade of the stable entrance, and she thought sometimes about the morning she had stood outside the land office with $4.32 and a piece of land nobody wanted, and about how the distance between that morning and this one had been measured entirely in work and in love, in equal and inseparable parts. Peter had become, over these 2.5 years, something she did not quite have the language for, because the word husband was true but insufficient. He was her partner in the most complete sense, in the business and in the daily life, and in the private interior life that was nobody's business but theirs. He had a way of knowing when she was tired before she said it, and a way of carrying extra weight at those times without making it a demonstration or a sacrifice, just quietly doing it because it needed doing. He made her laugh regularly, that dry, understated humor that crept up on you, the humor she had described as her father's, and that she had found again in this unexpected person. He had also turned out to be extraordinary with Eli, with a patience and a gentleness that Dorothy had hoped for but had not been certain of, and watching Peter with their son in the evenings, sitting on the front step in the long summer light or in the lamplight of the kitchen, the two of them conducting the solemn, incomprehensible business of a man and a very small child getting to know each other, was one of the sustained joys of Dorothy's days. Copper, the colt she had named for the valley, had grown into exactly what Peter had seen in him, a horse of exceptional athletic ability and an intelligent, willing temperament that made him a joy to train, and a horse that people offered good money for when they saw him going. Dorothy had refused every offer so far, partly because Copper was their best advertisement for what the ranch produced, and partly because she was simply not ready. Peter did not press her on it. In the autumn of 1886, a letter arrived from a man in Denver named Whitfield who had heard about the Copper Valley operation through Beaumont's Texas network. He was writing on behalf of an investment group that was interested in acquiring well-run horse operations or partnering with them on an expansion basis, and he offered to come to the valley to discuss possibilities. Dorothy read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at Peter. "What do you think?" she asked. Peter read the letter. He thought about it. "I think it's worth hearing," he said. "On our terms, in our space, with our accountant present." They had engaged a young accountant in Millhaven earlier that year, a recent arrival from Missouri named Draper who was thorough and careful, and who Dorothy paid fairly and trusted. "And if he offers something worthwhile?" Dorothy asked. "Then we look at what it means for the operation," Peter said. "For the horses, for the people who work here." Dorothy nodded. This was how they made decisions together, looking at all of it and then agreeing. They had disagreed, of course, over the years, in the direct and honest way of two people who respected each other enough to say what they actually thought, and they had navigated those disagreements without injury because neither of them had any interest in winning at the other's expense. Whitfield came in October. He was a pleasant man, organized and intelligent, and he was clearly prepared to do business, but he was also clearly not prepared for Dorothy Norris, who sat across the table from him in her kitchen with Draper the accountant beside her, and asked the kind of questions that made it evident that she knew exactly what her operation was worth, what its liabilities were, what its growth potential was, and what kinds of arrangements she was and was not willing to entertain. Peter sat at the other end of the table and mostly listened, which was his role in negotiations. He had learned that Dorothy was better at them than he was, and he was entirely comfortable with this. And he watched Whitfield's expression shift over the course of 2 hours from the comfortable expectation of a man who thinks he is doing someone a favor to the more careful attention of a man who realizes he is dealing with an equal. The arrangement that was ultimately struck was a limited partnership, in which Whitfield's group provided capital for a significant expansion of the facilities, a larger stable, more corral space, a proper bunkhouse for 4 hands, in exchange for a share of profits over 10 years, after which the full ownership reverted to Dorothy and Peter. Dorothy retained complete operational control. The terms were her terms with minor modifications. Whitfield agreed because the operation was producing results that his investors wanted access to, and because he was, in fact, a fair man who recognized that trying to control Dorothy Norris's operation would be the same as killing what made it work. "You drive a precise bargain," Whitfield said at the end of the second day of negotiations, with something between appreciation and amusement. "I've had good practice," Dorothy said. Construction on the expanded facilities began in November of 1886, and through the winter Dorothy and Peter and Cal and Henry worked alongside the builders to bring up what became, by spring, a genuinely impressive establishment. The new stable could hold 12 horses. The expanded corral was large enough for proper working with a group. The bunkhouse was solidly built and comfortable, and it attracted 2 additional experienced hands by spring, men who had heard about the operation and who wanted to work somewhere that was doing things properly. Eli turned 1 in December and took his first steps in January across the kitchen floor toward his father's outstretched hands, and Dorothy stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching this with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very bright. And Peter looked up and caught her watching, and his face did the thing it always did, opened entirely, all the careful reserve gone, just the man who loved her looking at her from across the room. The spring of 1887 brought the opened-up operation to full activity. The Army order doubled. Beaumont's Texas business grew. Several new private clients came through recommendation. A story ran in the Denver newspaper, a small piece but a real one, about the Copper Valley Horse Ranch, about its training methods and its reputation, and Dorothy read it at the kitchen table with Peter and then set it down and said, "Well, well," Peter agreed. "My father used to say that the best things are the things you build slowly," Dorothy said. "Smart man," Peter said. "He was," Dorothy said. In March of 1887, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant again. She told Peter immediately this time, in the stable in the morning before breakfast, because she could not wait, and because the stable was where they often had their first conversations of the day, moving around each other in the comfortable, synchronous way of 2 people who had shared a life and a space for 3 years. Peter put down what he was holding and looked at her. He was smiling before she had finished the sentence. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she could see that he was. "Thoroughly," he said. The second pregnancy was easier in some respects and harder in others. She was busier and had less time to rest, but she was also more certain of herself, more confident in what her body was doing and less frightened by it, and Peter was watchful without being hovering, which was exactly right. The summer of 1887 was the summer the Copper Valley Horse Ranch was written about in a second paper, this one from Colorado Springs, and the summer that 2 ranchers from New Mexico made the journey north to see the facility and left with agreements for a combined 8 horses a year. It was also the summer that Copper was finally, after much internal deliberation by Dorothy, sold. He went to a rancher from Wyoming, a man named Cassidy, who had come on recommendation and who handled the horse with the kind of quiet confidence that told Dorothy he knew what he was doing. She stood with Peter watching Copper load into the trailer for the journey north, and she felt the leaving of it, the particular bittersweet quality of selling something you love because it was always meant to be sold, because it was always meant to go out into the world and be what it was. "He'll have a good life," Peter said. "He will," Dorothy said. The money from Copper, $120 for a single horse, which had caused even the unflappable Whitfield to raise an eyebrow when he heard about it, went into a fund Dorothy had been building for a specific purpose she had been quietly working toward for months. She bought back her father's land. Not all of it, the heart of it, the 40 acres that had been the home place, the original barn and the creek pasture that Eli Norris had built his life on. It had passed through the bank to a speculative buyer from Kansas who had done nothing with it, and when Dorothy made a careful, fair offer through Draper, the Kansas man accepted without significant negotiation because he had no interest in Colorado land and had been losing the carrying costs for 2 years. The deed came through in October of 1887, 2 weeks before the birth of her and Peter's second child. Dorothy stood in the land office in Millhaven, the same land office where she had stood 4 years earlier with $4.32, and she signed the deed for her father's land with her married name, Dorothy Norris Atkins, using both names as she had always used both names, and the county clerk filed it and handed her the copy, and she folded it and put it against her heart. She did not cry. She thought about crying, and then she thought about her father, and she thought he would have found it better to laugh. And so she laughed, a small sound in the quiet land office, and the clerk looked at her with gentle puzzlement, and she thanked him and went outside. Peter was waiting with the wagon. He had known what she was doing, and he had driven her in and waited because he understood what it meant. He looked at her face when she came down the steps, and he reached down his hand and she took it, and he helped her up onto the wagon seat, and then he looked at the folded deed. "How does it feel?" he asked, the same question she had asked him 3 years ago on their wedding night. "Like something being finished," Dorothy said, "and something beginning." Peter smiled. He recognized his own words. He flicked the reins, and the wagon moved down the Millhaven Main Street into the cold October afternoon, the mountains clear and blue above the valley, the golden grass bending in the light wind, the whole of it spread out before them, familiar and beloved. Their daughter arrived on a windy night in late October, and there was a particular quality to that evening that Dorothy would remember afterward with completeness: the wind in the junipers on the hillside, the fire misses. Calder calm and certain at the bedside, and Peter's voice outside the door quietly talking to 2-year-old Eli, keeping him company in the night, telling him the kind of low, rambling story that small children find comforting regardless of the content. The girl was smaller than Eli had been, with her father's reddish-brown hair already showing even in the first minutes, and she looked at the world with an expression of alert, intelligent interest that made Dorothy laugh immediately. "She looks like she has opinions," Dorothy said. "She's your daughter," Peter said. They named her Margaret Maggie for daily use, and Eli, brought in after, looked at her with the solemn, comprehensive assessment of a 2-year-old, and then declared her little, which was true, and which seemed to satisfy him. The operation going into 1888 was genuinely what it had been called, the most talked-about ranch in the valley. It employed 7 people, including Dorothy and Peter, produced between 30 and 40 trained horses per year at a range of price points depending on level of training, supplied produce and eggs to most of Millhaven, and a market stand on the Valley Road that Dorothy ran on Saturdays through the growing season, and had an annual revenue that would have seemed fantastical to the woman who had stood on 3 barren acres with $4 and a letter that said, essentially, "This is all you have." The original 3 acres were still visible in the operation if you knew where to look. The first corral, expanded but with its original posts still in it. The spring in the hillside that fed the well and the irrigation channel and the water trough along the west fence. The junipers that Dorothy had never cleared, that still grew along the base of the hill, that she had always liked and had always said added something to the look of the place. She was standing near those junipers on a morning in early spring of 1888, the air cold and clear and scented with pine resin, Maggie bundled against her chest in a carrier, Eli running in circles across the new pasture for the pure pleasure of running, when Peter came out of the stable and crossed the yard and came to stand beside her. He stood for a moment looking at what they had built. The stable, long and solid, with its clean lines and the Copper Valley Horse Ranch sign that Cal had painted and hung above the door. The expanded corrals with 3 horses working in the nearest one, Henry quiet at the center, the horse moving around him in the clean early light. The garden, still under its winter mulch but ready, the raised beds Dorothy had built over the winter to make the gardening easier on her back. The bunkhouse and the cabin, the wagon under its cover, the water trough bright in the morning sun. 43 acres total now, including the father's land, which they worked with 2 of the hands, running a small cattle operation. They're of the kind that complemented rather than competed with the horses, and which gave the overall ranch an integrated quality that interested visitors and made agricultural sense. 15 horses currently in various stages of training. 7 employees. 1 partnership with Whitfield's group that had 2 more years to run, and that was already showing the shape of a full buyout rather than a reversion. Whitfield, having indicated with the directness Dorothy appreciated that his investors would like to buy a full stake if she was willing, a conversation she was having with Peter and with Draper, and not yet finished. A reputation that had traveled further than Colorado. 2 newspaper pieces. A letter that sprang from a man in Kansas City who wanted to know if she would write down her training methods for a quarterly journal of agricultural practice. She was thinking about it. Peter turned to look at her. The morning light was on his face, the particular clear light of a Colorado spring morning that made everything distinct and bright, and he looked at her and at Maggie bundled against her chest and at Eli running in the pasture with the absolute freedom of a happy child, and his expression had that quality again, the one she knew, open and certain and full. "I have been thinking," Peter said, "about what you said about your father." "Which part?" Dorothy asked. "That he always said a thing worth doing was worth doing every day until you didn't have to think about it anymore," Peter said. Dorothy waited. "I think he was right," Peter said, "about most things. But I want to say something different." "All right," she said. "Some things are worth thinking about every day," Peter said, "even when you don't have to, even when they're already done and certain, because the thinking about them is a kind of gratitude." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment in the clear spring morning. Eli had found a stick and was now engaged in some elaborate game with it at the far fence. Maggie was asleep against her chest, warm and heavy and trusting. The horses moved in the corral with their steady, beautiful motion. The mountain stood above the valley, blue and permanent. "What are you thinking about?" Dorothy asked. "You," Peter said. Simple, direct, the way he said everything that mattered. This, all of it. Dorothy reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his in the way she had done 1,000 times now, the way a thing that started as new and electric becomes also deep and certain, becomes the way your hand knows the shape of another hand without having to think about it. "I think my father would have liked to see this," she said. "All of it." "I think he sees it," Peter said, not in a way that claimed certainty about things nobody could be certain about, but in the way of someone offering a comfortable possibility, something to stand on. Dorothy leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "Eli Norris Atkins," she said, calling to the running boy, "come see the new foal." And the boy came running, stick abandoned, face bright, and Dorothy took his hand and Peter took his other hand and they walked together toward the stable, toward the new foal that had arrived in the night, toward the day's work and the day's joy, both of which were present in equal measure and neither of which Dorothy Norris Atkins could imagine being without. The spring continued to warm and deepen around the Copper Valley Horse Ranch, and the work continued, and the life continued, and everything that had been built from nothing kept being built, year by year, in the daily choosing of it, in the love that was both the reason and the reward. In June of that year, the deal with Whitfield's group was concluded, a full purchase of the partnership stake at a price that Draper had negotiated over 4 careful months, and the deed was held entirely and without condition by Dorothy and Peter. She pinned the final document above the desk in the small office she had built into the corner of the stable, next to the letter from the army post that had been the first real sign of what they were building, next to a photograph taken the previous autumn by a traveling photographer who had come through Millhaven. A photograph of Dorothy and Peter and Eli and Maggie standing in front of the stable with the ranch sign above them and the mountains behind them. She looked at that photograph sometimes in the early morning, in the quiet before the day started, and she thought about all the mornings it had taken to get to this one. The tent in the winter cold. The first frozen post she had driven into the resistant earth. The morning in the general store when she had first seen a tall man arguing about a horse's shoe and had found herself walking over. The February evening when she had kissed him in the garden and felt the world tip gently and permanently toward something better. She thought about her father and how he had given her everything she needed, even in the end when the only thing he had to give was 3 acres nobody wanted. She thought about 3 acres and what you could do with them if you were willing to work and willing to love and willing, in the face of everything that said otherwise, to build. Cal was in the corral with a young horse. Henry was coming up from the far pasture. Peter was in the stable, talking to one of the mares in that low, even voice that the horses trusted completely. Eli had found Maggie, and the two of them were in the garden with the intensity of purpose that small children brought to any project involving dirt. The sun was over the eastern hill, and the valley was golden below it, and the spring of 1888 was wide open ahead of them, full of horses and work and growing things, and all the ordinary, irreplaceable richness of a life built exactly as it was meant to be. Dorothy Norris Atkins stood in the morning of it all and breathed it in, the pine and the horses and the turned earth and the particular clean air of a Colorado spring, and she was content in a way that was not the absence of wanting more but the presence of everything that mattered, which was a different and better thing entirely. She went into the stable to find her husband. He was where she knew he would be, with the mare, his hand at her neck, the horse leaning into him the way horses leaned into people they trusted. He heard Dorothy come in and turned his head and looked at her in the morning-lit stable and smiled, the real smile, the rare one that changed his whole face. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. And it was.